I'd like to welcome everybody watching on the live stream back to our virtual symposium. We are going to be joined in just a moment by Dr. Piers Robinson. The title of his presentation is Understanding the War on Terror as a Propaganda Event, the Formative Years 2001 to 2003. Now, Dr. Piers Robinson is co-director of the Organization for Propaganda Studies, and before that, he was chair of Politics, Society, and Political Journalism at the University of Sheffield in the United Kingdom. He has published extensively on propaganda, pardon me, media, and international politics. And he's joining us right now. Welcome, Piers.
Okay, thank you, Pat. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Good, okay. Thanks very much for having all of us on. And what I'm going to do in my talk, if you want to put the first slide up, what I'm going to be doing in this talk is talking for a few minutes about propaganda and just making some general points which might be familiar to some of your audience and perhaps not familiar to others about propaganda in the contemporary world, and talking a little bit about sort of why we have great difficulty within the academy and also within the establishment to grasp points about manipulation and deception and propaganda in democracies. And I then want to really try to give what I would describe as an overview of, I think, where we are in terms of what we understand about the global war on terror. And I'll do this in two steps. I'll talk a little bit first about the Iraq and the weapons of mass destruction, deception, stroke propaganda, which has become, in many ways, quite commonly accepted. And I then want to go through and talk about not just the question of sort of specific examples of propaganda or deception in the context of the global war on terror, such as Iraq WMD, but talk about understanding the global war on terror and 9/11 itself as essentially propaganda constructs or propaganda events. So the whole global war on terror writ large being understood as a form of propaganda whereby people's beliefs, actions, and so on are being mobilized in a particular direction. And I'm going to go through to conclude by talking about where this takes, I think, the academy in terms of where it should be focusing its attention now, and also bring a link through, as some of the previous presenters have, to the question of COVID-19, because I think understanding 9/11 is a road to understanding COVID-19 and vice versa. And it's important that we start to draw the links and so on. So that's what I'll try and do in the course of the next 20 minutes. First off, we maybe go to slide 2, this question of propaganda in contemporary democracies. We do live in an environment within mainstream academia, certainly suffers from this, but also within the political establishment more widely within the West. That propaganda is seen as something which occurs elsewhere. It's something which the Russians practice, or something which you can observe in historical examples. And there's certainly been, over time, as Professor Phil Taylor pointed out, that there's a euphemism industry has developed over time where propaganda activities are relabeled as strategic communication, psychological operations, public relations, of course, is a frequently used term. And this kind of relabeling exercise has gone on over the course of the last 50 years, getting propaganda out of the vocabulary, out of people's minds, means that people in the West have, in many ways, fallen into a sort of an area of just simply not recognizing that even in our own societies, even in our own democracies, propaganda is there, that we are continually, constantly subjected to attempts to manipulate not just our beliefs, but also to manipulate our conduct and our behavior, our actions. And I put there up in one quote there, you have Edward Bernays. And of course, Edward Bernays is considered by many as a founding father of public relations. He coined the term public relations in order to replace the term propaganda, as he famously pointed out that propaganda had been given a bad name by the Germans in World War I. And so they came up with a new term, public relations. But Eddie Bernays represented this belief system in the early 20th century that the intelligent manipulation of the mind was an essential part of managing democracies, that it was seen as a necessary and important. The only way you could run society effectively and so on would be through the use of these techniques of manipulation. And there's also, I mean, to the extent that propaganda overlaps with notions of deception, there's a quote there from Crystal, the neoconservative, talking about essentially, this is a kind of incarnation of Plato's noble lie, a very elite view on the world, that there are truths for the ruling class, and there are truths for the working class and the workers and so on. And these things don't match, that they're different. And this is really sort of speaking to this idea, it's almost an ideological commitment to the notion of deception and to the notion of propaganda, that manipulation, deception of people is a necessary part of maintaining order and maintaining the structure of society. Of course, that's a generous way of putting it. A less generous way of putting that is that it's about serving elite interests, elites protecting their own power and their own influence through the use of myth, lies, and propaganda. And that's one of the, I think, one point to make about academia. And when I say academia, mainstream media and political establishment, is this failure to recognize the importance of propaganda in the contemporary world, which I think is fundamentally undercut their intellectual ability to really start to grapple with the kind of questions which the presenters today are talking about, and the kind of issues which we see with 9/11 and the global war on terror, and which we're seeing now with the COVID-19 event. We do live in a world where there's extensive deception, and until we recognize that there's extensive propaganda, we're vulnerable to forever living blindly, as it were, to the way in which power is operating and exercising. So let's just talk a little bit now about the global war on terror and the question of deception and propaganda. Now, it's worth, and if we go to slide 3, it's worth talking a little bit about Iraq and weapons of mass destruction. Now, I mean, from a scholarly point of view, and even from a mainstream academic point of view, I think it's reasonably well established now that there was a significant deception in the case of the invasion of Iraq back in 2003. I say recognized because even in relation to this issue, which is in a sense widely accepted by many people in the public, that this was a deception, there's propaganda surrounding this conflict. Even with academia, even though there's a kind of grudging acceptance of it, a lot of academics try to sort of either avoid the subject or sort of refer to other explanations of, well, maybe there was groupthink, maybe they weren't deceiving anybody, they all just got into a sort of groupthink dynamic and misunderstood the intelligence and so on. But I think, the historical record is fairly clear now that in the run-up to the Iraq War, and you can see there on slide 3 that the infamous, famous examples of the British government publishing the dossier, Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, the claim that Iraq could launch weapons within 45 minutes of an order to do so. That information started to flow out after the invasion of Iraq was over, famously, of course, with Dr. David Kelly and also Ambassador Wilson over in the US starting to leak and talk to journalists after Iraq had been invaded, after no weapons of mass destruction, which of course had been used to justify the invasion, after which none of those had been found. You start to see this leakage coming out. And then after many inquiries and also further leaks, it became very clear that in relation to the claim of Iraq possessing weapons of mass destruction, that in the months leading up to the invasion, the intelligence services, in this case, the British intelligence services, had worked pretty closely with the British government in order to cherry pick the intelligence, in order to sort of hide information which wasn't convenient, exaggerate information, weak information and intelligence, in order to create ultimately the impression that Iraq was a clear and present danger, that it had an active weapons of mass destruction program. And you can see this in the show notes for this, attached to this particular talk. You can see some publications which go through in painful detail an analysis of the documents which are now in the public domain, where you can see the actors involved, John Scarlett from the Joint Intelligence Committee, as well as other people in the British government, working hard to, as it were, craft a dossier which ultimately presented an incredibly misleading impression of the weapons of mass destruction capability that Iraq had. It essentially had no capability. It had remnants of a past program. But they needed it. They needed it to get to war. They needed it in order to make the war legal, in inverted commas, from a British point of view, to justify the invasion. And this has become accepted. I mean, it's worth pointing out that we see a similar dynamic, and anyone who follows my work will be familiar with the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons and the issue of alleged chemical weapons attacks in Syria over the last 10 years, from Ghouta 2013 through to the now controversial alleged chemical weapon attack in Douma in 2018. And you have there something which is very similar, I think, to what we saw with the Iraq WMD. You see allegations of chemical weapons use, of banned, prohibited weapons being used by the Syrian government in order to shore up and build and strengthen the position of Britain, France, and America and other countries who have sought to overthrow the Syrian government. At points in that conflict, famously the Ghouta 2013 sarin attack, it was a moment at which the pressure was really piled on to the US administration to launch a significant intervention into into Syria at that point. And it's a similar set of processes, and it's becoming clear now that there is deception in relation to this chemical weapons attacks in Syria. And in a way, it's Iraq WMD 2.0, and it's also a more extreme version of that, in the sense that with Iraq, you had the manipulation of intelligence to suggest that Iraq was producing chemicals, producing weapons of mass destruction. With the case of Syria and the alleged chemical weapons attacks, you've actually had the evidence indicates strong grounds for concluding that opposition groups have staged events, for example. And the sort of latest work coming out about Ghouta 2013 indicates that, and obviously with the case of Douma, the evidence that we have piling up on that indicates that that was staged as well. And so you have actual sort of creation of events on the ground for the purposes of propaganda, and in the case of Syrian war, but very similar to, in a way, to what we saw with Iraq and WMD. Now, this is understanding the sort of, as it were, elements of the global war on terror and propaganda that's being used. But I think more importantly now, in a sense, for academia more generally, is what we understand about 9/11 and the events in the weeks after that. And if we go to slide 4, and I'll want to talk about essentially understanding global war on terror and 9/11 itself as a propaganda, as a propaganda event and as a propaganda construct. And so whilst there's been some tolerance within some establishment and academic circles around the idea that there was deception over WMD and the invasion of Iraq, what became very well evidenced following the Chilcot inquiry, which was the investigation into the British involvement in the Iraq invasion in 2003, what became very apparent with that inquiry and the documents which came out was that even in the very early stages, in the weeks after 9/11, that there was planning between the British and American governments in order to embark upon a regime change war. And so what you see, and again, in the show notes, there's a couple of articles which detail some of the documents which came out in the Chilcot inquiry into this. But what you see here in these documents is actually planning for regime change wars, most of which were not really connected to the notion of combating Al-Qaeda, combating Islamic fundamentalist terrorism. These were conflicts designed to essentially try to remove from power governments which were seen as not on our side, a regime change policy. And these documents which came out of the Chilcot inquiry, you can see there in slide 3 at the top, you can see Wesley Clark. He actually came out with this similar information in 2006, 2007, and he stated publicly in a couple of events, he said that shortly after the 9/11 attacks, he was in the Pentagon and he had been informed that America was about to embark on a wide-ranging series of regime change wars. And the Chilcot inquiry and the documents which you see, and you can see one document there, that's from I think it was phases 1 and 2 of the War on Terror. And you can see there that there's a conversation. And these are documents exchanged between Blair and Bush, discussing sort of when to attack various countries. And the suggestion there from Tony Blair is that they sort of leave Syria in Iran for now and focus on and so Saddam is a prime objective. It's easy to do with Syria and Iran favoring rather than attacking all 3 countries at once. So what Wesley Clark was saying in 2006, essentially corroborated by the documents which came out with the Chilcot inquiry and corroborated by other officials now, other American officials have come out and said something very similar to what Wesley Clark said. And you can see there's a bottom quote there from a British embassy cable, just to make the point clearly that you had essentially at that point, you had a decision to exploit 9/11, exploit the war on terror in order to clear up other problems in the region. All the while, as you can see from the bottom left-hand corner of that slide, all the while that this was going on, and the planning documents, I very much recommend that people go and read the Chilcot report, or at least read the articles in the show notes which detail some of these documents. It's really quite extraordinary, because whilst Tony Blair and George Bush were planning regime change wars, Tony Blair was talking to the British public via the Mirror there, talking about "I will cure the world," and talking about a whole raft of humanitarian initiatives that should be carried out. So quite extraordinary in a sense, the mismatch between what's going on behind the scenes and what Tony Blair was saying in public. But what that all leads us to is that really, the war on terror itself, both 9/11 to the extent that it's an event which became used in order to justify conflicts which didn't really have anything to do with the alleged Islamic fundamentalist threat. It's a propaganda event. It's what Peter Dale Scott described as a deep event, which allows political actors to exploit and to use to achieve much wider political goals. In this case, regime change war, but also, of course, domestically within the US, you see the Patriot Act, you see the arrival of bulk surveillance, and of course, torture going on under the cover of the global war on terror. It's a significant major sort of intensification, essentially, of the concentration of power in the US that you can see at the point of 9/11 and across other Western democracies, rolling out regime change wars, whilst at the same time sort of putting in place various mechanisms to control domestic populations within the West. And that, to the extent that this is, I argue that this is established, it's established in the sense that scholars such as Noam Chomsky, is I think happy to sort of make the argument that 9/11 and the global war on terror, these things were used in order to do other things. They were propagandized and so on. So there's a kind of acceptance at the margins, but I mean, and this point has been made in previous talks, academics are extremely timid about really sort of digging into these aspects of the global war on terror. And really most of the academic research in the mainstream at the moment continues to be very limited in that respect, even though I think it's reasonable to say that it's established. There's enough evidence there, okay, from Chilcot inquiry documents, from people like Wesley Clark, and also, of course, from the actual course of events that we've seen over the last 20 years. Conflicts carrying on, new conflicts being initiated and fueled. And we see this in Libya, we see this in Yemen, we see this in Syria, we saw it in Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on. So pattern of events, as well as the documented evidence, as well as the statements of officials, demonstrates that that's pretty much what we should, as academics, accept as the truth. This brings me to my final set of points that I want to talk about. So in a sense, we have, I think, we go through the Iraq WMD, which is almost the acceptable area to talk about deception. It's become acceptable in the mainstream. It's become moved into the area of, as it were, legitimate controversy, as Daniel Hallam described. The question now is where that all takes us, in the sense of we have that, but then we have now the recognition that the war on terror itself and the 9/11 itself has been used at the very least as an event in order to start wars, which weren't really anything to do with, or a very limited relationship to the alleged Al-Qaeda issue that was presented at the time. It's been propagandized on that level. Where does that take us intellectually? Where it takes us, I think, first of all, obviously, we have conflicts in the international system ongoing today, and we have Syria, and we have, if we go to slide 5 now, we have Syria, we have the continuing possibility that there will be war initiated against Iran at some point. And if one thinks about the claims that Wesley Clark made, he talked about, the end game was Iran. And of course, Iran wasn't turned up in documents which you see between Bush and Blair. So we're still in a situation where that might still occur, an attack on Iran at some point. We still have the conflict in Syria, the continued attempt to overthrow the Syrian government, the support for extremist groups trying to overthrow the Syrian government. That's still ongoing, is quite fluid. So the kind of what has flowed out of the 9/11 and those early years of regime change war planning are still very alive and active. Academics, certainly in the case of Syria, and certainly as people who are familiar with my work and also my story, as it were, will be familiar with how difficult it is for academics to look critically at Syria and to look at the questions of alleged chemical weapons attacks without being attacked and smeared and so on. But these are all sort of critical areas now which people need to explore and to research more fully. But most importantly, and this is really the key point here, is that if we've moved ourselves, as it were, and I'm looking at this from this kind of mainstream academic point of view, if we've moved ourselves on from, okay, we accept there's deception in the case of Iraq, we now accept that 9/11 has led to this, the 9/11 and the whole global war on terror is in a sense a propaganda construct. The question then inevitably begged is, what about 9/11 itself? So we've already got a lot of deception being documented at multiple levels. What about 9/11 itself? And it's very clear at now, 20 years in, that the official story on 9/11, as David Hughes pointed out and in his talk, is incorrect. Now, I think empirically, because as I said in the introduction to this webinar, I said that one of the reasons for the working group being set up on the global war on terror and propaganda is this idea that the academic work hasn't really been properly done. Now, in some ways, it has been done. There's a lot of excellent independent research out there, and as Richard pointed out, there's quite a body of literature, and David as well, on this subject. But I think in terms of getting mainstream academia, they really now need to engage about literature and to now start to properly, objectively analyze the question of the actors involved in 9/11. The official story is clearly incorrect. It has so many errors and holes in it and so on. One can confidently say to mainstream academics, this doesn't stand up anymore. So now we need to start to explore what really did happen. And so this obviously brings in the question of which state actors are involved, which I think is one of the key questions that needs to be drawing upon the wealth of independent research, but also marginalized academic research, which has been carried out up to now. That is a key area of focus. Obviously, this overlaps with engineering scientific analysis of the building collapses, as you saw in David's presentation. If we look at slide 5 again, I mean, the recent book, I recommend members of the public, for example, take a look at the recent book by McGuinness, Unanswered Questions, 9/11 Unmasked, David Ray Griffin and Woodworth's book, which essentially pulls together a large body of material over the last 20 years, which highlights that basically the holes in the official story and things which don't make any sense. Also the film 7, which is available, and that talks quite extensively about the AE 9/11 funded study by Professor Halsey at Alaska Fairbanks, which has been looking at the building collapse, but the World Trade Center 7 collapse. And Halsey's report, which came out a year or so ago, was pretty conclusive in terms of finding that the building, I think the most interesting finding from his study was that he said the only way the building could have collapsed and the way that you see it collapsing is if all supports were removed at the same time. So leave people to think about what might have caused that and come to their own conclusions. But this is the areas which I think we have to now grapple with, that there has been deception over Iraq. There's been a deception in the sense that the war on terror has been used to propagandize and enable regime change wars. Now the question is, who is actually involved in this? And do we need to start looking at it through the lens of the state crimes against democracy? And to emphasize, there's a huge body of research out there. I think now mainstream academia, if it's going to try and salvage its reputation, particularly critical terrorism studies, it now needs to start to engage with that literature and start having a serious, honest and open discussion about that. This just leads me to my final point, which I'll end on, is that under everything that we know about 9/11 and the global war on terror and the way in which 9/11 has been used as an event to initiate, to do other things, as it were, to pursue other policies which are tangentially related to the public perception of what's going on. This is clearly directly relevant to what we're living through now. And David made this point very clearly, and I think Richard referred to it as well, and Dan after me will talk more extensively about this. But understanding 9/11 and the global war on terror is clearly relevant to what we're seeing at the moment, because in many of the parallels, and this has been pointed out by many people now, by people like Graham McQueen, I think Whitney Webb wrote a piece along these lines. I wrote a piece at the start of the COVID-19 event, talking about the parallels with 9/11. We have a major event. There's clearly massive amounts of propaganda associated with it, just as we had 9/11, big event, large amounts of propaganda associated with it. And with COVID-19, we're seeing a similar set of processes in terms of major, in this case, major political and economic agendas being developed and pursued under the cover of COVID-19. And so it's the same sort of question of we have a deep event and we now have potentially 9/11 in a sense, on steroids, as some people are saying, in terms of the way in which COVID-19 is being exploited to bring through massive changes to the economy and massive political changes, very frightening times in general, for most of us to be observing what's going on. But in that area, there's excellent work out there, and there's huge amounts of attention. What I'm finding as an academic and a scholar who looks at propaganda is that myself and a lot of others who've been looking at global war on terror and 9/11 for many years, we're seeing that people are sort of starting to pick up on that, but also sort of drawing upon our expertise and our understanding in order to understand better what's going on at the moment with COVID-19. We've got a similar, so it's a similar case in terms of propaganda, in terms of exploitation. And this time, as Niels Harrop pointed out, we seem to be going into a very direct confrontation between establishment and elites and publics. So in a sense, the global war on terror there was propagandized to get us to attack countries around the world, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, attack populations in those countries effectively. What we see with COVID-19 is this translation of these pressures onto, or these attacks onto populations within the West. So we had to clamp down on civil liberties, suppression. We have the threats of mandated injections, threats of segregation, moving into a profoundly undemocratic phase. But we can learn, in terms of COVID-19, we can learn a lot from people who understand 9/11 and the global war on terror and the propaganda surrounding it. And also, by the same token, I think that people who understand COVID-19, because a lot of people clearly are recognizing propaganda, recognizing it's being used to do other things, the economic and political changes which are being ushered through, those people understanding what they're seeing, as that we're not just seeing, but living through. I think this quite significant sections of populations across the West now are pretty much more open to understanding the global war on terror as propaganda, and 9/11 as a propagandized event, and an event which is not the way in which government officials have presented it. And mainstream academia and mainstream media as well, presenting it in terms of the official narrative. So it's a very dangerous phase, as I pointed out elsewhere, for our democracies. But this is a moment in which I think many people can go through quite a steep learning curve about propaganda, deception, and the threats that we ultimately face from our own governments, from establishments who sort of preside over us. And on that, I shall finish.
Dr. Piers Robinson, for that presentation. Just one question, one comment as well. I wanted to send back in your direction. What was interesting is one of the things that really sold 9/11 and, or sorry, more specifically, the Iraq War, the WMD story that you pointed out to earlier, was official or intelligence sources in mainstream media. And so official sources would drop in anonymous sources in the New York Times, the Washington Post, etc. And that sort of validated the claims about WMDs, or certainly it reinforced them and gave the public more confidence that these were coming from trusted intelligence sources through major newspapers. So why question this? But afterwards, of course, we find out that that wasn't the case. So and certainly that would have dented confidence in the intelligence community or the intelligence agencies. And it's the same situation we had with Russia, but there you had the media basically turning the tables and browbeating the president. Why are you not accepting the advice of the 17 intelligence agencies that Russia has colluded or meddled in the 2016 election? And the media and the intelligence community are loosely defined. They closed ranks on this. And this seems to be, whenever there's an important issue, like Hunter Biden's laptop was the same thing, the intelligence community released a statement saying that this is probably Russian disinformation that's planted, that the New York Post ran, and so therefore it was blacked out on social media and not talked about till this day, pretty much. So that's my comment to you, and my question as well is, this mechanism still seems to function even after it's been discredited so many times. So is there any chance that it can be discredited once and for all, or is this just a feature of life in our societies where we have this corporate media and we have these agencies of government that are very influential?
Yeah, it's Groundhog Day, isn't it? It keeps on coming around, and the same things happen. I think now with COVID-19, and also this does link into what you're talking about with Russiagate. Russiagate has so totally come off the rails, objectively, whatever the blue ticks might be saying in America, but it's so completely come off the rails very, very quickly. And now with COVID-19, In this point I was trying to make at the end, that sort of we see the parallels with 9/11, but with COVID-19, this is operating on a global scale. And all the things that we saw in relation to 9/11, we're now seeing in relation to COVID-19, on a massive scale. So we have, with 9/11, you had a few scientists here and there, Stephen Jones, Kevin Ryan, getting fired, pushed out of their jobs for raising questions in the early years. Now with COVID-19, we've got large numbers of medical scientists and medical professionals. Some are losing their jobs at the moment, but others are making, very high profile. Professor Robert Malone, for example, speaking out, talking about propaganda, talking about bias. And we have large numbers of people in a sustained way out on the streets protesting against COVID-19 restrictions or vaccination, lockdown, and so on. Levels which are unprecedented. I've never seen this in my lifetime. It's obviously a much larger pushback than you saw in relation to people questioning 9/11 after that occurred. And I think we're potentially at a tipping point. I think that the recognition of quite how hollowed out our parliaments, our legislative bodies, our mainstream media, our academia actually are, I think that awareness is rapidly growing, and it's going hand in hand with the pushback, not from everybody, obviously, but from still a significant proportion of the population. And if it's the case, and we don't know what's going to happen, if it's the case that COVID-19 unravels and essentially people realize that this virus is not the way it has been presented, and that it is being used in order to usher in big political changes. And if that's stopped, then I don't think there's any coming back for various establishment entities. I think that then there's a real potential for widespread awareness of the problems in our political systems, widespread awareness of the need for change, and that's the only, so that's the sort of the silver lining in all of this. But that will only occur if the current agendas can be derailed. But if they are derailed, then I think we do have some hope that we can start to have the problems which people like you and and I think everyone in this webinar have been talking about for years, have those problems start to be rectified. The fact that we don't have a functioning media, we don't have a functioning parliament, academia, and so on. These things are all broken, essentially. And so now is at a point where I think we can potentially have change. But that's going to depend on where things go from here and how things play out in the coming months. I'd say years, but actually I think the coming months are going to be critical. So I think there is hope that we will perhaps put an end to just the levels of deception we've seen and the levels of propaganda that we've seen dominating our societies for so long. The point of 9/11 and intensifying now onto a sort of global level with COVID-19.
An encouraging note, Piers. We appreciate it. Certainly, that's definitely needed as well. And like I said earlier in the introduction, there's aspects of all of these presentations, including that of Dr. Piers Robinson and the other presenters as well, which warrant a full conference or symposium in their own right, even details within those presentations. And so we are just really giving a general analysis on some areas that we think are really important to focus on in this symposium today. Now, again, thank you to Dr. Piers Robinson also for his organization, the Working Group on Propaganda and the 9/11 Global War on Terror. And we will provide a link, a URL to his organization, which you can also support if you'd like to, if you're listening and watching us right now. We'll include that in our show notes below the video player on this.